Welcome back to Nature Labs and our continuing coverage of the 2025 Canadian federal election. Though at this late hour, we still don't know if the next government will be a Liberal majority or minority. We are learning a lot, so let's get into these facts. For starters, if it is a minority, the Bloc Québécois are poised to hold the balance of power in the House of Commons. This is an interesting twist of fate. The percentage of votes that the Bloc Québécois have gotten in this election is down from the past results. Of course, they've also lost seats in the House of Commons, and support in Quebec for separatism is at an all-time low. Yet, the Bloc are poised to hold that balance of power, and when you couple that fact with the Parti Québécois, their provincial cousin, poised to form government in Quebec after their next election on the provincial level, there's a ripe circumstances for Quebec separatist movement to push forward their agenda at the most inopportune time for the nation as a whole. Of course, facing the multitude of crises that we are, especially the threats from Donald Trump on the trade front to our economy, as well as his threats to annex our country, any disunity across the nation is going to be a point for him to expose and potentially capitalize on. So the Bloc's position in the House of Commons is worth paying attention to, especially in light of the fact that their actual power has been diminished, yet might somehow be increased just by the twist of fate of how the polls have turned out tonight. So that's interesting fact number one. Number two is where Western alienation stands in this election. We're not going to know for sure yet tonight, and certainly the Liberals did make inroads in Saskatchewan and Alberta to some degree, although we're not quite sure what that looks like at this hour. But unquestionably, Pierre Poilievre did exceedingly well in the Western Prairie provinces, and that means there's going to be bitter disappointment in some quarters that he wasn't able to convert that into government, that he wasn't able to form government. Of course, he ran in many ways on a prairie nationalist agenda, something that many in the Prairie West embraced, and we're hoping that the rest of Canada would embrace as well. The fact that the rest of Canada didn't wholeheartedly embrace it might leave some to flow into the arms of this fledgling Western separation movement. And again, at a time when our country needs to be united in the face of crisis, this is another major concern for our nation and something that needs to be watched carefully. Of course, what does this mean for the parties themselves? Well, other than having a nightmare scenario potentially for Prime Minister Mark Carney and the Liberal Party by not forming a majority, he's going to have to find a way to find willing partners in the House of Commons, either with the Bloc, the Conservatives, which have been massively hostile to the Liberals, or a deeply diminished NDP and Green Party, and will not almost certainly hold the balance of power either. So that's a hard path for him to be able to advance his agenda, but certainly he ran in a campaign as being a unifier, someone who could bring Canada together, and boy ever are we going to have to see if he can deliver on that promise. For the Conservatives, in some ways you can look at tonight as a resounding success. A couple of weeks ago we thought they would be doing even potentially more poorly than they did in the last election. This after leading the polls for almost 2 years, at one point 25% up in the polls. So an outcome like this, where they've grown their seat count from where they were at dissolution to a place where they're going to have a powerful voice in the next Parliament's makeup, that's a resounding victory for the Conservatives from where they were just a few weeks ago, or even what people perceive them to be this morning. There is a but, however. They had a 25% point lead at the start of this year, and they blew that. So in some ways, tonight's a resounding defeat, because they should have formed government. Everyone thought Pierre Poilievre was prime minister in waiting, and yet he wasn't able to convert those poll numbers into government. Now, the real question here is what happens to his leadership? Was his leadership style the reason that he was not able to become prime minister, or was his leadership style the reason he was able to grow the Conservative base, especially with younger voters, and actually deliver a higher seat count and vote total than many people expected, certainly the polls? Which brings us to pollsters. Now, that of course includes your teacher, Sachi Curl. We'll have to ask her questions about how this all played out from her perspective. But from our perspective tonight, the polls weren't wildly wrong, but they did undervalue, as we keep talking about tonight and we keep saying for months now, the ability of the Conservatives to fundraise, ID their vote, and get out their vote. We are seeing the analytics at play in the political campaign, and certainly benefited the Conservatives tonight. It's why we were always skeptical, as you know, that we should write off the Conservatives in this campaign. It always gave them an inherent advantage, and certainly they have capitalized on that tonight. So from an analytics point of view, from being a modern political party point of view, the Conservatives have done a very good job, and they've also done a very good job at not only IDing their vote, but getting young people out to the polls. That's a demographic. I don't have to tell you, that doesn't always come out to vote, but they did tonight. So that does show you that Pierre Poilievre is onto something with his agenda, his tone, his style, his policies. That's also something to watch going forward. How does that mesh in a minority parliament, if that is indeed what it ends up being? How does that impact his ability to stay on as leader? Can he even win his seat? Because that's in jeopardy at this moment. I think he'll probably pull it out, but we'll see. And all of those questions are going to be factored in, because on one side of the ledger, Pierre Poilievre did exceeded expectations. But those are only expectations that you can count in the last few weeks. If you take into account the last few months, he massively underperformed on expectations. So never has there been a political leader like Pierre Poilievre who can look at tonight as a complete disaster or a resounding victory. And how that is judged within his party and by the Canadian electorate will go a long way to determining his future as a politician in our country. But our advice, don't write off Pierre Poilievre. The NDP probably don't write off as a party, though Jagmeet Singh is in tough tonight. He's almost certainly going to lose his seat in Burnaby, which is a suburb of Vancouver. His party is not going to have official party status. That means it loses that all-powerful status in the House of Commons, which gives them money and prestige and position to argue their agenda on behalf of their party. So without that, they're a significantly diminished party. But you got to remember, in the history of Canada, the NDP has ebbed and flowed with time. And even though, and at times it has lost official party status. So the party, the brand, especially because it's doing so well in certain provinces where it actually holds government, I think is fairly robust, and there's still a good chance the NDP will bounce back in future elections. But certainly the future of Jagmeet Singh as its leader it's unlikely that he will be able to continue on. The Green Party is a very interesting case. Co-leaders, one has been elected, one most certainly did not, and of course their most popular MP in southwestern Ontario looks to be going down to defeat. So what does this mean for the Green Party? Well, they've kept a foothold in the House of Commons, so they're not completely wiped out. That keeps them in the game potentially to be part of debates in the future. It ensures that they remain a relevant party, unlike the People's Party of Canada. Now, the vote share between the Greens and the PPC isn't that significantly different. The PPC did underperform their polls tonight. Maxime Bernier came in a distant, in his riding where he was running. He did not come close to winning. I think it was fourth place that he ended up, a distant fourth place, I might add, in his riding of Beauce in Quebec. And this is a real question for the People's Party of Canada going forward. Can Maxime Bernier continue as leader, given that he's kind of made the party around his personality? Does the party have a place in this in this sort of diverse political landscape that we're seeing kind of evolve tonight? Those are questions to be answered as well, but certainly a resounding defeat for the PPC tonight. And of the Bloc Québécois, as we've already discussed, it's a disappointing night. They lost vote percentage, they lost seats, yet they still stand to potentially gain more power than they had in the last House of Commons. So a lot has changed on the Canadian political landscape, ideologically, from a political party structure, from how people will be able to wield their power in the next House of Commons. And if the vote total ends up being this close between the two major parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, there's going to have to be an effort to have bipartisan or cross-party support for policies so that we can move our country forward on the questions of our time. But that will be a real challenge for both Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre, who've staked out very stark differences in the policy landscape and have promised very different sets of agendas that they want to pursue. So how they're able to overcome those firm stances and find ways to collaborate and work together and make sure that Canada can come through this crisis together, that's an open question. And that's the biggest question I think we're left with tonight, is how do we move forward as a nation? How do we enhance our democracy and fortify our institutions? How do we protect our economy? How do we protect our sovereignty? And of course, how do we still find space for all those other issues that haven't just gone away? And that does include the environment. And I'll finish on this point. The environment, as we discussed before, was not a major factor in this election. In fact, fewer than 15% of Canadians said they still think it's a major issue. An astonishing fact when you can take into the account that the impacts of climate change are increasing. Of course, biodiversity loss is speeding up, and Canada can play a major role on these issues, and yet it's not a major factor for Canadians. And yet, the issues that are a major factor for Canadians, quality of our cost of living, and how we address the Trump trade war, those issues almost always interact with environmental issues. So how that's all managed going forward is something to watch, because our national unity debates, our economic debates, our sovereignty debates, all of that will have a big role and big impact on the environment. And of course, very key constituencies in the Liberal government, even if Mark Carney wants to move to a more centrist position, he has to take into account how he formed his government. That includes significantly strengthening the Indigenous voice behind his party. And the Indigenous voice isn't always on the same page when it comes to the environment and economy debates as, say, opposition leader Pierre Poilievre, and that's probably reflected in the outcome of the election tonight. It also includes in his governing party Will Greaves, your teacher, professor at the University of Victoria. He's won a seat in Victoria, and he'll be part of the governing Liberal Party in Ottawa. And Will brings a strong environmental perspective as well. So those voices haven't been lost, the issues haven't gone away, but how we reconcile that with some of the promises that have been made by Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre and how they're going to work together in this fractured House of Commons, that's the real question. So even though at a time when the environment seems to be completely off the radar, at a time when no one seems to care about the environment anymore, the environment will still play a major role, and maybe the most important role in the most consequential debates in our next makeup of Parliament, from national unity to the economy to where we go forward as a nation. So this is why we still believe that nature and the environment can be an important common starting point for learning, for going forward into some of these subjects, so we can better understand why different Canadians in different parts of this country have different views, and how we can find a way to reconcile those views to move forward together as a country is the real challenge of our time. And of course, it's the challenge that you're working to tackle in class. We hope all of this tonight has helped you make sense of the election campaign, how it relates to what you're learning in class, and how it relates to the future that you will shortly inherit. That was our job tonight, and we'll keep you posted in the hours and days to come as we learn more information. But at least for now, we hope we've given you a bit more context to move forward with.